Evening, assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to News in Focus. My name is Fahraaz Patel. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. Today, my discussion is going to be on this book here, Mafia Land by Kyle Cowan. And when reading this book, you get an understanding of just how compromised South Africa has become in so many sectors of society, but none more so than when we saw in July 2025 this year, when KZN Police Commissioner Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi gave that infamous press conference to speak about the criminal justice system and how it's been captured by criminal enterprises. But this is not just about the police. There's the construction mafia, there's the water tanker mafia, there's even the Chatham House mafia, and the list goes on. And just like how Peter du Toit would sum it up in the cover of this book, it truly is terrifying. So joining me now to take this discussion forward, I'd like to welcome the author of Mafia Land, Kyle Cowan himself. Kyle, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, it's an absolute pleasure. Kyle, I got the book from you. Within a week, I read it, and there were shivers going through my spine just seeing how this hard-fought democracy has gone into the hands of criminals on such key, important components of our country. And I guess you felt the same, didn't you, writing this book and doing this in-depth investigation with regards to it?
Yeah, for us, I spent my life as an investigative journalist at News 24. Every single day, I deal with stuff like this. I talk to people involved in these things. Our investigative team, under the direction of Peter du Toit, we delve into these things, on a daily basis. And over the past sort of 8-9 years, I've really spent, investigating, stories of national importance and with a national footprint. And what I've discovered and what has happened is that the more you get exposed to this, the more you get used to it. It sort of becomes normalized, and you don't often take that, just that 1 or 2 steps back just to reevaluate where we are, what's going on, and what does a specific story mean that I might be working on the day-to-day for News 24. What does this actually mean in the bigger picture? So the book is, it's just me having, everything that's in that book I talk to my colleagues about all day, every day, and we discuss it. And I just took a step back and said, okay, let's take a look at the bigger picture here. Let's see if we can sort of just sketch, in some, every chapter deals with a different sort of syndicate / mafia, and we tried to sketch the broad sort of strokes of each one of these. It's not a super in-depth book. It's not a super forensic book. The idea behind it is more to just tell a story.
Yeah.
And it's a book that you should be able to read within a day or two, very quickly, and just hopefully give you something to talk about around the next braai fire.
Yeah, no, definitely. Kyle, there's of course 12 chapters to this, so look, we won't be able to speak through all 12 of that, but I'm really going to ask our citizens to buy this book, to go and get it, to read it, because it really gives you an understanding, especially in light of the Madlanga Commission, which we are going to speak of later. But what's interesting, what I found out in the prologue, Kyle, is that there was this, before the release of your book, you've mentioned something about the F.W. de Klerk Foundation publishing this damning report about integrity and oversight in South Africa's law enforcement. And this was since the start of democracy up until this year. And it's quite scary, isn't it? Because it just proves that there has not been a full term completed by the National Director of Public Prosecutions. And every single SAPS National Commissioner left under a cloud of controversy. Now, what we would want as South Africans is a sense of consistency and stability. And unfortunately, when you look at that report, we are nowhere near that happening.
No, not at all. And and I think it speaks to something much deeper and much broader, in that it's such a highly contested space for a reason. You know, the idea that there's fighting and contestation over these positions.
Mm.
You know, many of us when we talk, you know, when we go for coffee or we meet up at
Mm.
the shopping mall and we just run into each other, we have a quick chat about you know, inevitably as South Africans we'll talk about,
Mm.
hey, you know, the government's
Mm.
terrible,
Mm.
things are happening, how's your business,
Mm.
this sort of thing. And in a lot of the time that discussion sort of misses a key point, you know, is that
Mm.
when we talk about people like the National Police Commissioner or
Mm.
the Director of Public Prosecutions, we always wonder, you know, are the police actually doing a job? There's always a
Mm.
lot of scorn and a lot of sort of, you know, we all deride policemen for being, you know, famously corrupt
Mm.
or useless or etc. But the level of contestation around those
Mm.
positions, the amount of fighting that happens in the upper ranks of the police and in the
Mm.
prosecutorial circles around who gets to be in that position, and the lobbying that happens with presidents who appoint
Yeah.
those people and ministers who appoint those people tells us that this is still a very critical facet of our democracy. It's still
Mm.
very important. We should be watching these processes with hawk eyes. And sometimes, you know, myself as a journalist, I've
Mm.
been guilty of it myself. I take my eye off that ball
Yeah,
just a
sure.
little bit, focusing on other things. And we really should be paying closer attention to it because the fact that no national commissioner has finished their term, you know, it's for a multitude of reasons. It's either corruption or they were arrested in Jackie Celebi's case,
Mm.
they were charged, etc. But there are other reasons as well. There are political reasons
Mm.
why these people are removed. And that tells you, while our police and our prosecutorial authorities are supposed to be completely free of political interference, they're not.
Mm.
It's very political. These decisions that are made around who to prosecute and when to prosecute them in these big cases,
Mm.
even though there is no direct evidence of any politician influencing that,
Yeah.
the outcome and the perception of that is that it is political and it has been influenced. So, you know, that stat, that sort of one line
Mm.
headline figure that no one has actually finished their term, it's actually a lot more important than just, you know, saying, oh, you know, it's actually quite surprising.
Mm.
There's something much deeper and I think more sinister behind that.
Yeah. Kyle, you know, you've mentioned Jackie Salebi, and the reason why I'm starting for us to go back in time, it's because this all leads to how these mafias have been able to operate without really a credible sort of criminal justice system or authorities that can go ahead and prosecute these individuals who are committing who are part, of course, of these criminal syndicates. And we go to 2008 when the Scorpions was effectively killed off. And then
Yeah.
you've got individuals like Jackie Salebi, like Richard Ndluli, who you mentioned, even Becky Cele, who was, before this administration, the Minister of Police. Every single one of these individuals compromised with allegations towards them. Some of them, of course, charged, like Jackie Salebi. And you're asking
Yeah.
yourself just how entrenched from a political perspective we are as a country having these individuals in such important positions.
You know, it struck me.
Mm.
I was watching the president speak during his address, his political report at the National General
Yeah.
Conference, the NC's conference that's happening now, and he was talking about reformation and
Mm.
renewal. And you know, this is a talking point that Cyril Ramaphosa and many senior people in the ANC bang on about constantly. Is,
Mm.
you know, we're reforming the party, criminals must leave, and all this kind of thing.
Mm.
And I'm thinking, you know, right behind him
Mm.
are people sitting that have referrals from the Zondo Commission
Yeah.
for criminal investigations around Bosasa.
Mm.
There are, you know, there's Paul Mashatile, where,
Mm.
you know, as part of the News 24 investigations team, we've revealed
Yes.
extensive question,
Mm.
it's not just speculation. There are massive question marks around
Mm.
how Paul Mashatile has attained wealth in his life. And you're standing there with a straight face saying
Mm.
that, you know, these reforms are important to us. It's ANC policy now to clean the party and, you know, clean up corruption, but it's actually just lip service.
Mm.
It's actually just window dressing, because if you look at the people that you constantly surround
Mm.
yourself with in senior leadership structures, if you look at members of your cabinet,
Mm.
people that, you know, in your government function as president you've appointed to run in your cabinet, who have criminal cases hanging over them,
Mm.
you know, allegations of criminal conduct hanging over them, you know, so it's exactly the same
Mm.
in the police. And I think that you're quite right for us in
Mm.
pointing out that, you know, there's a starting point where all of this
Mm.
started to sort of go downhill,
Mm.
to use the colloquial term,
Mm.
because yes, in any structure you expect there to be a percentage, a level of corruption and malfeasance and mismanagement. You're not isolated, but there is always going to be a level of that in any police service anywhere in the world, in any prosecutorial service anywhere in the world. And the difference with us is that that has become the higher percentage. Mistrust and distrust in the police and prosecutors and judges even has become higher than it has than just that little bit that you expect. So we need to flip that scale. We actually need to rebalance that. And we need to start that by, number one, hiring more policemen. Hiring more investigators. I mean, as we sit now, the vacancy rate within the Hawks, for example, that is supposed to be this elite crime busting unit, is hovering around 50%. So you can imagine the people who are there trying to do a good job, how overloaded they are, and also underpaid. And this is something that we don't talk about very often because of the level of mistrust in police. I think people don't want to talk about paying our cops more. But if you look at the jobs that they are being asked to do and the risks that they are being asked to take in a country like South Africa, being a police investigator that looks into serious cases of murder or corruption, that should be one of the best paying jobs in government. And the reality is that they are being paid absolute peanuts. And that is why we have cops who aren't willing to put their lives on the line. And I cannot blame them.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Kyle Cowan. We're going to be going. His book is 12 chapters long, but we're going to be just discussing some of the important parts of the book, the important parts of these chapters, especially how the mafia of each of these peaks of society or elements of society have infiltrated and have done so at the taking of lives of so many of our South African citizens. News in Focus returns after this break. Welcome back to News in Focus. Now, Kyle Cowan, of course, has written 12 different chapters mentioning each of these sectors of society and how it is being run by these criminal elements. So, though we do not have the time with us, we're going to try and break down at least some of them. Kyle, I want to start off with the construction mafia, because this is one where if you do not play ball with these criminal elements, your life will be taken. And we've seen the rise of this happen in the last 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, the construction mafia, it's really, and in the book I try and draw it back to, it's not a unique South African problem. The old sort of mafia families in New York figured this out in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. You can stop a construction from going ahead. You can stop an entire construction site through, threats of blackmail or violence or extortion. And in South Africa, that has taken on, quite a unique South African flavor. That we have these procurement regulations that sort of ask that 30% local requirement is. It's basically saying, when you build a hospital somewhere in rural South Africa, the local community has to draw some kind of a benefit from that, whether that be jobs or skills transfer, etc. And it's quite noble. It's a way to get, to transfer those skills over, to get people to potentially have something that can make them employable in future. And we don't have to get into how, high the unemployment and poverty rates in South Africa are. They're absolutely stratospheric. So, and what these construction mafia guys figured out is that if you control that process, if you control who gets to be part of, who gets job at the site, or who is hired, what local subcontractors are hired to deliver cement or bricks or provide catering, etc., then you can make quite a lot of money without really having to do any of the work. And that problem has absolutely exploded. And it's the modern variation of it has started in KZN, and we saw quite a lot of, we're talking about construction projects with billions upon billions of rands. And these people are very violent. So they drive around with AK-47s, and some of them have graduated to driving the armored vehicles themselves, and they have a seat at the political table now around these projects. Specific room is cut out for them out of the pie of this project, so that they can be happy about how the level of involvement that they're getting. And it's a problem that genuinely just requires hard-nosed policing and investigation and real prosecution. So far, what we've seen is that A lot of these construction companies are having quite a lot of success sort of hiring consultants that help them work through these problems. And, with the new minister that's come in, there was something signed called the Durban Declaration, where the new minister, Dean McPherson, working together with other departments, including National Treasury, what they've actually done is they've switched the game. So now they're telling people, particularly in public sector construction, engage the community first. Get in on the ground floor. You be friendly with the community long before these construction mafia guys get a chance to move in and take over. And in doing something as simple as that, we're already seeing a positive effect. And then there's a law enforcement response as well, particularly in KZN, a lot more arrests, a lot more people being charged. And it is starting to have a positive effect. But you need to gain that momentum initially in fighting back against them and maintain it over a long period of time. It's really, really difficult policing work. It's a real difficult problem to deal with.
Kyle, I want to go to the water mafia because when we read our constitution, and the United Nations itself has explicitly said that each citizen of the world has the right to clean water. Unfortunately, the water that many of the residents of our municipalities and metros are getting are coming from these water tankers. And these water tankers are being run by sinister individuals who are making money out of it and really milking these municipalities and metros. And when you look at the Auditor General's report, it shouldn't be surprising that she flags so many municipalities in terms of how bad their audits are. And a lot of it comes down to the lack of service deliveries. The scary thing about this is that when I read your book, there's so many of the higher echelons of our politicians that are involved, and you're thinking to yourself, how can this actually continue?
It can't continue. It's something that, water in particular is something that really made me quite angry every time we come across this, or, in the research for the book as well, I found myself getting very angry because it's such a basic thing. It's like you said, it's a basic human right. And I think that the water tanker mafia's existence is also legacy for something else. It's legacy for, really a lack of investment in maintenance and sort of, replacing water reticulation systems over years by lots of municipalities all across the country. We're talking about in the metros and the big cities and where, in Johannesburg particularly, there's quite a big problem with this. Pretoria, there's a very big problem with this. But in the smaller municipalities as well, we've seen local sort of business groups getting up and running water systems, and winning court cases to be allowed to do that. And we've seen, Afrikaner lobby groups who get quite a lot of criticism for their sort of impact on geopolitical things, doing grassroots stuff, getting involved, even in villages out in Limpopo and getting water systems to work. Because technically, and, from an engineering standpoint, there is a very high level of technical sort of sophistication around the very big bulk water supply systems. But in terms of the reticulation systems and managing it on a smaller scale, this is not super complex. It requires money to be spent and maintenance to be done. And that hasn't been doing. And I think that is a bigger conversation that we maybe need to have as a country around technical capacity and the impact of corruption in local municipalities and how people are appointed, because it's a lot easier to simply steal the money than actually spend it on maintaining water systems, which is not very sexy. And it's very, it's underground. No one really cares about it until it breaks. But, in terms of that's one facet of it. And then there's just, this pure criminality and opportunism. When the water pipes are broken, or the water treatment plants aren't running properly and residents don't have water, these water tanker guys step in, and I'm reminded of this example again, after those deadly floods in the Eastern Cape quite recently, and, Gift of the Givers and Imtiaz Suleiman went down. And they were just supplying water. Gift of the Givers has these tankers, and it's become so entrenched that even people were brave enough to threaten Gift of the Givers workers and tell them stop giving water because, their intention is to sell water to them. Now, this is a situation where people have died. It's a disaster area. And that just speaks to you. I think that tells you the conscience that these individuals have. They have no problem taking money from people who are in absolute dire straits and even threatening others who are trying to help them for free.
Yeah, and there's something interesting that you've mentioned there, Kyle, that it's up to civil society, whether it's AfriForum, Solidarity, Gift of the Givers, that they are the actual ones that are going and actually supplying the water to people, of course, within a legal framework parameters.
Yeah.
And I think to myself, but it's supposed to be the job of governments, whether it's in the municipality or the metros. And therein lies the malaise, doesn't it? That it needs ordinary citizens, not government representatives, to give what you've just mentioned right now, a basic human right, which is water, which every single South African citizen deserves.
Yeah, and we have a water scarce country. South Africa, in the summer, especially if you live in the Highveld, you can be forgiven for thinking that because it rains so often, you can be for thinking that water is not a problem. Water is a big problem in South Africa, and we are facing many, many very technical and deep challenges into the future as our population continues to grow and cities get bigger and expand in areas where that infrastructure just doesn't exist. And what we are seeing now is obviously, and this is what happened with Eskom and electricity as well, is a deep, it's just a deep misunderstanding of how demand feeds onto these systems, and then also what impact you can have in 1 year in a municipality, for example, if councillors decide to cut the budget for maintenance of these things because they want to spend the money elsewhere, etc. That the impact of that is felt years and years down the line. It's and there's a lack of that understanding, and then we have corruption that sets in, and people, money is being stolen, and revenue collection is not being done properly. So there's lack of bylaw enforcement. So it's the snowball effect where things just get out of control. And all of a sudden, then you have a municipality where they just have no money to do anything, really. And normally, in my travels around the country, as I do my job, one of the first things that I do, especially if I'm in a town where I haven't been for a while, or if it's the first time I'm visiting a place, one of the first things you can see, other than the conditions of the roads, is if the town is being well run or not, is if the grass is being cut.
Yeah.
If you stop at an intersection and the grass is so tall you can't even see the oncoming traffic, you just know that there are going to be problems elsewhere. And it's those sort of basic skills, those basic things. If you can't get those basic things right, you're not going to get complex things like maintaining and replacing water reticulation systems when they're outdated, or getting the engineering done for the bulk water supply systems. And I think that is multitude of problems: ineptitude, incompetence, corruption, but then also a lack of willingness to accept that we don't have the expertise in the government anymore to do these things. And we do hire people, but there's a procurement problem, because we have procurement rules that dictate that we must hire companies that have X amount of black ownership, etc. And that's where it ends. We never ever ask questions about technical capacity and ability. And that's where the problem really lies. I think that there has to be a sea change in that. Then we can sort out these basic problems. And once we sort out these basic issues like water, electricity, grass being cut, no potholes in the roads, you'll find that people are a lot more willing to overlook your other political failures. And I'm talking about voters especially here. Then, if they're driving down a potholed road every day, don't have water at their house every second day, that's what makes people angry. That's what gets people mobilized. And I think our politicians are yet to find that out. I think it's starting to cost them, but it hasn't really cost them very much at the ballot box just yet.
I couldn't agree with you more. After the break, before we touch on those explosive revelations on July the 6th this year, we're going to have to speak about, obviously, Babita Deokaran and her flagging at the Tembisa Hospital. And that's where we'll continue after this break. Do stay tuned to News in Focus. Welcome back to News in Focus. Now, Kyle, before we talk about, obviously, Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi's revelations, I just want to touch on the hospital mafia, because it's so important that when we look at the murder of Marius van der Merwe, a whistleblower, a witness that was supposed to obviously come to the Madlanga Commission, it would be remiss of us not to speak of Babita Deokaran. And I know your colleague Jeff Weeks had done such an explosive revelation with regards to her murder and the flagging that she did of companies when it comes to Tembisa Hospital. And you mention it quite at large in your book. And still till today, we as South Africans are not getting that answers. And I'll speak for myself, and I'm sure you would probably agree with me, Carl. We're still in shock about how this murder of Babita Deokaran happened. And I do remember News24, of course, running so many articles when that murder had happened in 2021.
Yeah, it was one of those very, very quite soon after,
Mm,
Babita was killed. My colleague Jeff, who just absolutely tackled the story. Like,
mm,
I think one day we'll be writing textbooks about how to do investigative journalism
mm,
around something like this. And Jeff has just done such an exemplary job. And very early on, he figured out that this wasn't just and it sounds almost callous to say this. It wasn't just another targeted killing, which because there are so many at the moment in our
mm,
country, it's hard to keep track. But she was someone who had worked very diligently within the Gauteng Department of Health over
mm,
many years, passing on a lot of information to law enforcement around investigations. And sadly, I think that while she was trying to do the right thing, the law enforcement agencies just weren't keeping up with their responsibilities in terms of doing those investigations. And in this case, it's very clear that this extraction network that she had put her finger on, that she had figured out was something was really fishy was going on. They extracted upwards of 2 billion rand from that one hospital,
mm,
and she was very prescient about this. She knew that it was quite dangerous, and it's one of those things. She said to her boss, that if I'm worried these Tembisa guys will come after us if we close the taps on these
mm,
payments, which speaks to the fear that she must have been operating in. She knew that if she pushed back too hard, and it makes me wonder. It makes me wonder how many good people are in positions in the South African government around the country who feel the same, who are also tired of corruption, who are also tired of these things, but who know that if they push back too hard, if they close the money taps, that they could be next. And
mm.
it's very sad for me. I think it's very, very sad and very worrying that could be a reality for so many people and is a
Mm.
reality for so many people. And I wonder sometimes, when I think about these, how can we support them better? How can we, help them? And the only thing that we can do, particularly as journalists and people who write books every now and then, is to tell these stories, to tell the
Mm.
stories that these people want out there, and in so doing, try and shield them, and get them to work through us in a way to do this, because unfortunately, law enforcement is just, I don't think it's a viable option right now for these whistleblowers.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more there. Kyle, 6th of July 2025, you of course mentioned it in your prologue. And that was such an important day, wasn't it? Whether you're in favor or not of Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi,
Yeah,
how much it spoke of the criminal justice system potentially being compromised. And I'm sure
mm,
when you were writing your book, you said this had to be really part of the chapters within this
yeah.
book because it really spoke of the criminal justice system and an important part of our country, which is at this very moment having so many question marks with regards to it.
Yeah, I will say this openly. I
Mm,
don't agree with everything General
mm,
Mkhwanazi does and says. I don't think that he is the last word on truth.
mm,
I genuinely don't believe that, but he must be given credit
yeah.
and praise, I think, for highlighting something. As an investigative journalist, we've known, I think many people know
Mm,
on daily experience that the police is
mm,
fundamentally broken. That there was always going to be corruption in the higher levels, etc. And we can have an argument about whether everything that General Mkhwanazi has said is true or not. We could that's a different conversation. What he has done is that he's captured the imagination
mm,
of the country, and we've seen the Madlanga Commission and the ad hoc committee in Parliament. It's being followed like a
mm,
soap opera. People are absolutely engaged with it, and just the internet memes. Sometimes my colleagues and I are laughing ourselves half dizzy because of it's just so funny. South
mm,
Africans have an unmatched sense of humor, but it's critical. It's absolutely critical, and I wish that there had been a story that we had written at some point or another that could get people as focused and as
mm,
worried about the state of the South African police service, because believe me, we've tried.
mm,
And it's sort of what has happened now is so important for us for
mm,
for the next 10 to 15 years of this country. What we need now genuinely is we need people to keep that level of interest up, because often what we see, particularly with these commissions, is, and it's quite interesting. You could actually see it the other day. I was talking to a colleague of mine when former Minister Senzo Mchunu went in front of the Madlanga Commission, and when he started talking about facts, figures, numbers, and money, and all these sort of very boring things, the viewership levels on the live stream all started dropping. People were not really interested, and that's unfortunate because that's where the facts lie. And so I hope that the Madlanga Commission completes the journey that Mkhwanazi has set South Africa on. If the Madlanga Commission completes that loop and actually makes real recommendations, and people actually follow those recommendations and do something about it, we can see a net positive. But I'm afraid, and I worry, because maybe it's the cynical old journalist in me, that we're going to see much of the same as Zondo. We're going to see all these recommendations being made and no real urgency in following them up, and then it's just going to start the cycle from the beginning again.
Yeah, Kyle, I agree with you there, because we've seen this movie play out, the story play out, and unfortunately, this is where we are. I hope both you and I are proven wrong in this regard. You know what, Kyle? This is not something new, because in your book, you write about, and I like the way you've mentioned it, the first seismic shock. Jackie Salibi, he's the National Police Commissioner between 2000 to 2008. His relationship, his friendship with convicted drug trafficker Glenn Agliotti, and of course, the murder of Brett Kebble. And this was really where we saw how compromised the criminal justice system within our country. So I think for South Africans, it's important to look back at that time to see that what we now hear from Mkhwanazi, whether he's right or wrong, was not something new. This has happened before.
Yeah, and I think it's important also to note that this is not a uniquely South African problem.
Yeah.
Compromised senior police officers, there's a reason why it's such a popular thing in movies. It legitimately happens, and we have to guard against it. We have to watch out for it. And in South Africa's unique history, I think what people forget quite often is that we've only been a democracy for 3 decades or so. We still have a lot of figuring out to do as a country, and it is very critical that in these sort of early stages of the Americans love talking about a democratic experiment. So in these early years of our own democratic experiment, of our own democratic project, we have to guard against these things very, very jealously. And that's why, as journalists, we go after these problems with such vigor and verve and vim, because we've seen from, history teaches us what happens in other countries where you just allow these things to become normal. We have to tackle it strong. There has to be a deeper interest, I think, from members of the public. If there's one wish list I could, if there's one thing on my wish list I could try and achieve, is to get more of the public more interested more of the time in these problems. We see around, Madlanga Commission, a lot of interest. That tapers off. It disappears. And then the next national commissioner comes, and the next head of crime intelligence comes, and it's problems again from start, and we're sort of trying to watch all of this, but there's so much else going on. So I just wish that if there's one thing that comes out of this Madlanga Commission, even if we don't implement all of the recommendations that will come out of it, I just hope that the public will remain more invested in these problems, that it gives us, when there's a bigger public outcry after we publish these stories or these books, it gives us more impetus. It gives more impetus to change and to continue focusing on these problems. And in doing so, once these corrupt individuals know that you're watching them, that you're looking over their shoulder, it makes it a lot more difficult for them to carry on down that road.
After the break, I wrap up my conversation with Kyle Cowan, and we're going to be speaking on how important investigative journalism has become now more than ever within South Africa. News in Focus wraps up after the break. Welcome back to News in Focus. I'm in conversation with Kyle Cowan. And Kyle, of course, is one of the leading investigative journalists within the country. Of course, he's won the Taco Caper Award for that very same sphere within journalism. And there's something interesting you mentioned, Kyle, at the foreword of your book, that South Africa has this proud and hard-fought tradition of courageous investigative journalism. And of course, you're not just a journalist, you are a citizen of the country, a father, a husband to someone, and you put your life at risk doing this work. And it's something Jeff Weeks also mentioned in other interviews with different media houses. Investigative journalism has become important now more than ever, hasn't it? Kyle, because if we did not know about corruption happening at the highest order, this is where investigative journalism comes and really tells the important story of this.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more. I hope that if someone is watching this and they take your words to heart, investing in the media is really, really important. There are too few investigative reporters in South Africa now. I think we're less than 10 full-time investigative reporters working in the country now, and there's simply too much going on for us to be everywhere all at once. I regularly have to tell people who come to us for help that look, I'm sorry, I don't have capacity right now, but if you give me a few months, I might be able to assist you. And it's sad. It shouldn't be that way, but that's the reality, and I think that it's if investigative journalism is done properly, done right, and if people understand more about what goes into investigative reporting, and which is we're trying to explain to people all the time, then they will see the value in it as well. So my call to anyone who might be watching this is that if you have an opportunity one day to put some money towards journalism, whether that is buying a subscription or if you have deeper pockets and you can help, give donations to a media house or anything like that, please do so. I understand that, a lot of the time you won't agree with some of the stuff that is published and you won't agree with the approach taken, but it still performs a vital function. See that bigger picture. And I hope that, people can start to value that. I think many do. I'm hoping that one day we can have more people valuing the role of not just investigative journalists, but even day-to-day journalists, guys who are in the trenches doing the day-to-day reporting, very difficult, long hours of work. And without that, truly, if there's an information void, imagine relying only on the government for information. They would tell you everything is fine, and then meanwhile,
Yeah. I mean, when you look at the impunity that we see within governments, when we look at, and this book really discusses it, that when you have capital, when you have these criminal networks working in cahoots of governments to fill their own pockets, this is where investigative journalism becomes important, doesn't it? And individuals like yourself and Jeff Weeks really go to the core of speaking about this to make sure that us as a citizen, our constitution, our democracy allows for that citizen to hold government accountable. And it becomes even more necessary when you look at communities who are deprived of their constitutional right. This is the important aspect of it. They can see through investigative journalism that somehow the questions that they would like to ask, which they can't reach, is being done by individuals like yourself, so that government can give their answers. And the Constitution says you have to give an answer, especially when it's affecting the lives of the citizen.
Yeah, I think that, we don't often enough just reduce things back to the most basic level of what our constitution and the law says. And I think that there are many people who work in government and politicians even as well, who have sort of turned their back on those ideals that were fought for and what South Africa has become. And you're so right. The trick is always trying to just get people to work with us and say, trust us and see that the information that they give us is used in a valuable manner and is used for the greater good. And that is honestly, one of the most difficult parts of this job is convincing people to trust you. And, I hope that in speaking out, in being one of the voices that will, I've always been willing to tackle bullies head on. I will always be willing to sort of speak out against if something is happening wrong that's right in front of me. I'm going to say something. I'm not going to keep quiet. And I think that in doing so, I hope that we can foster that trust a little bit more and show people that, you don't have to take the risk on yourself. You don't have to be the tallest tree. You don't have to stand out there with your name and, potentially expose yourself to these risks. There are people still in this country who are willing to help you, willing to step into that breach and fight that fight,
Kyle, one final question. For anyone who reads this book, the awareness, the education of it. How important is that? And there's something important that you mentioned also in the book, and you've said it now, that there are good people in this country. We want to make this country work. We want to see it prospering so that everyone can have a share within this country, so that the basic services are being delivered to its communities. How important is this awareness, this education? Once somebody reads the books, just to get an understanding that there are criminal elements out there, but it can be solved, whether it's now, whether it's 10 to 15 years' time.
Yeah, it's such a great point. I mean, my idea with the book isn't to make anyone depressed. It's not to make anyone, think that, we've given up and nothing can be done about any of these problems. There's still a lot that can be done, and there are people every single day who are fighting to try and turn the tide, who are trying to, do the right thing versus the, the easy thing, and who are putting their lives at risk. That is why we are seeing this rise in people, being assassinated, because people are still willing to stand up and stand against criminality. And I think that if you, in your daily life, particularly in the private sector, people are confronted with this kind of thing all the time, where, you're a supplier to a government department or a municipality, and you're confronted with corruption on a real sort of level, like right in front of you, very visceral. And I think if there's one thing that I would ask anyone who reads this book is just to, when you are in that situation, just remember reading about some of the people in this book who gave their lives, and just be that person who's willing to stand up. If more and more of us are willing to help one another fight this kind of thing and not allow it to happen, it'll become a lot harder for those who are determined to do it to actually succeed. So it's difficult. It's not easy. I know. Trust me. The risks are there. It exists. But the more people who stand up, the more people who refuse to get involved in corrupt schemes and dodgy dealings and things like that, the less the load on the South African Police Service is going to be, the less the load on you as an individual is going to be, and eventually we'll start turning the tide. Support your cops. I know it's hard. There are a lot of corrupt policemen in this country, and it's very difficult to know who to trust, but you can make that value judgment very, very easily. And when a policeman is not doing what is expected of him, hold him accountable publicly. Don't be afraid to say it. Don't worry that you're going to, get in trouble or anything like that. It's a wonderful thing about South Africa, where a lot of other, we have a fantastic level of freedom of speech, which, has been curtailed in other parts of the world where with dictatorial governments, etc. So remember, as bad as the South African government is, they have not yet started curtailing our free speech rights. Exercise those rights, get out there, speak, be an active citizen.
Yeah, and I think you and I can have this conversation, which is, I think, a beautiful part of being South African. Kyle, absolute pleasure having you on. Well done on the book. It was one of the best reads I have had in a very, very long time. And I hope you, the viewer, can go ahead and actually get this book, educate yourself, like Kyle said, not to be depressed, but to make you aware of what can be done within our country. Kyle, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Fahraaz. It's been a pleasure.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Kyle Cowan, author of Mafia Land. It is an essential read for you, especially during these holidays, wherever you are going. Get a copy of this book and just understand, especially now in context of the Madlanga Commission, what is happening within our country. That's all we have for you in News in Focus. From myself, Fahraaz Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.